Autumn, 1944. Eastern France sinks beneath weeks of rain. The roads, once hard ribbons of strategy, turn to rivers of clay. Supply convoys grind to a halt. What was solid ground becomes a trap of suction and weight. The air smells of fuel and wet earth, heavy with the fatigue of men who have fought too long on soil that refuses to hold them. German Panzers advance, then falter. Their engines growl in protest, their treads churning up nothing but brown water. The precision that once powered Europe's conquest now sputters in the mud. Steel, designed for domination, has met its natural enemy: softness. The officers shout for traction, for movement, for dignity. None come. Then beside them, movement, impossible, almost mocking. Small olive-drab shapes, no higher than a man's chest, skip and weave through the sludge. They leave behind not gouges but ripples. The German crews stare through rain-slick visors as the strange vehicles pass, barely cars at all, with no armor, no enclosure, no grandeur. A Panzer lieutenant smirks. Amerikanische Spielzeugautos, he says. Toy cars. Yet the toys carry men, ammunition, radios. They splash through the same mud that buries tanks, humming quietly, unbothered by the weight that has humbled giants. A corporal watches one climb the embankment as if the mud itself had chosen to let it through. "It shouldn't be possible," an officer mutters, but it is happening, right before them. Through the storm, these small machines seem to possess a will of their own, built not for intimidation, but endurance. Each one carries the same quiet confidence as the men who drive them: practical, unsentimental, forward-moving. In their simplicity lies something the Germans do not yet understand: a new kind of superiority. By dusk, the Panzers remain trapped in place, half-buried monuments to an age of precision. The olive-drab toys vanish into the mist, carrying messages, hope, and the rhythm of an army that refuses to stop. And somewhere in the rain, as engines die and laughter fades, a realization begins to take shape. Perhaps perfection is not strength after all. Title fades in. German officers mocked the Jeep until it outsmarted Panzers in the mud. The Jeep was never meant for glory. It was not born from a designer's dream, nor a general's ambition. It was summoned urgently, almost accidentally, by the simple necessity of war. In 1941, as America braced for a conflict that spanned continents, the Army issued a call: a lightweight reconnaissance vehicle, fast, durable, and replaceable. It was a request for utility, not beauty, and from that request came a shape that would outlive empires. The machine that answered it was modest to the point of anonymity. No armor, no doors, no polish to catch the sun. A flat hood, round headlights, canvas seats, each part chosen not to impress, but to endure. It was a soldier's tool, as honest as a shovel and as necessary as a rifle. In its stripped-down form lay the quiet genius of purpose. Everything that was unnecessary was left behind. Everything that remained worked. The Jeep's creators understood something rare in war: that perfection was the enemy of survival. Its parts could be replaced in minutes, repaired in mud, fixed with wire or wood. The steering was loose, the ride harsh, the wind relentless, but it always started. Soldiers came to trust that sound, the short cough of its "Go Devil" engine, as much as they trusted the man beside them. To them it was not a vehicle, but a companion. They nicknamed it the Faithful Mule, a creature of burden that never complained. Officers called it ugly, but eternal. Its profile lacked ceremony, but not presence. Wherever the front line shifted, the Jeep appeared first, leading patrols, towing guns, carrying the wounded. It crossed rivers, deserts, and bombed out streets with the same steady confidence. By war's end, It would go everywhere men fought, and often where tanks could not. It was a machine without rank, yet it outranked circumstance itself. In its simplicity lay democracy. A general and a private could ride in the same seat, shoulder to shoulder, equal in mud and motion. What no one yet realized was that this humble contraption, built for function, not fame, was about to redefine what victory itself looked like. Fade to black. A pause. Then, the echo of a question. How could such simplicity defeat perfection? For 2 decades, Germany had built its identity from metal. Its armies marched behind engines that hummed like symphonies, machines of balance, precision, and pride. The Panzer divisions were not just weapons, they were philosophy made mechanical. To German engineers, mastery meant perfection, and perfection meant control. Every conquest from Poland to the gates of Moscow had been written in the language of horsepower and gears. By 1944, the Wehrmacht was the most mechanized force on Earth. Its half-tracks and panzers were marvels of design, each part numbered, each system precise. Soldiers called them fortresses on treads, and for years they were right. The Blitzkrieg had proven that engineering could become a weapon of terror. To face a panzer was to face the promise of industrial destiny. And yet, somewhere on those same battlefields, another machine rolled forward, lighter, smaller, unadorned. It weighed barely a ton, cost a fraction of a tank, and had been built not in secret laboratories, but in ordinary American workshops. Its shape was plain, almost clumsy, but where the German war machine demanded perfection, this one thrived on forgiveness. It did not need smooth roads or ideal conditions. It simply moved, always forward, always alive. The Jeep was not designed to kill, but to connect. It ferried messages through chaos, carried commanders to the front, and rescued the wounded from mud that swallowed steel. It was not a weapon, it was a way of moving, and in war, movement was everything. Each time a panzer sank into the mire, the irony deepened. The same nation that had turned engineering into faith now watched as simplicity defied it. The Jeep, with its bare bones and humble engine, became the quiet answer to every German boast. In the mud of Europe, the lesson was written clearly. Precision means nothing without motion. The age of complexity had met its limit, and the machine that outlasted it had no armor, no rank, and no arrogance. Fade out. Somewhere ahead, the engineers of both nations were about to confront the true cost of perfection. Before the war began, Germany's confidence was not only military, it was mechanical. The nation had turned engineering into a form of worship. Every bolt, every bearing, every curve of steel carried a sense of destiny. From the Mercedes truck to the Panzer IV, machines were built not merely to function, but to express belief in superiority through precision. Factories became temples of order, engineers, their quiet priests. Each tank, each truck was a masterpiece, assembled like a watch, tuned to perfection. German craftsmanship sought beauty even in war, and the result was a fleet of vehicles that looked inevitable, flawless, and proud. Soldiers marched believing their machines were the proof of national genius, each one a mechanical argument against the chaos of the world. In the Wehrmacht, reliability was not enough. Perfection was the standard, but perfection has a hidden weakness. It demands conditions that reality does not grant. The panzers that conquered Europe in 1940 were products of precision, but also prisoners of it. They required the finest fuel, careful maintenance, and roads strong enough to bear their weight. When the terrain changed, their perfection began to betray them. Mud clogged their gears. Cold cracked their engines. A machine designed to be flawless has little tolerance for the world's imperfections. Meanwhile, across the Atlantic, a different gospel was being written. America's engineers saw war not as a test of elegance, but of endurance. Their vehicles were not designed to impress. They were designed to survive. Simplicity was not a compromise. It was strategy. If something broke, a soldier could fix it with a wrench or wire or whatever the land provided. The contrast was almost philosophical. Germany built machines that reflected authority, complex, precise, dependent on command. America built machines that reflected democracy, adaptable, forgiving, built for initiative. One nation engineered for perfection, the other for persistence, and from that second creed emerged a shape that would soon travel farther, faster, and freer than any Panzer. It could be dented, kicked, flooded, and still run. It did not rely on supply chains or privilege. It relied on trust, the kind of trust born from simplicity. To German eyes, it looked primitive. To American soldiers, it looked like freedom. In a war ruled by weight and hierarchy, it offered movement without permission. They called it the Jeep. And in the coming months, this modest machine would turn the gospel of perfection on its head. Fade out. In workshops across America, the race had begun to build a vehicle that could defy the very logic of war itself. In the summer of 1940, while Europe burned and America still stood watching from across the ocean, the U.S. Army issued one of the most desperate requests in its history. It asked for a miracle on wheels, a light reconnaissance car that could go anywhere, carry anything, and survive everything. The demand was staggering. Deliver a prototype in just 49 days. Not months, not quarters, days. To most manufacturers, it sounded impossible, but three answered the call: Bantam, Willys, and Ford. Each brought a different temperament, a different vision of what a soldier's machine should be. In their hands, urgency became invention. The race began not in laboratories but in garages, with engineers working through nights lit by acetylene lamps, pencils dull from use, coffee cold before dawn. The first to deliver was the American Bantam Car Company, a small firm from Butler, Pennsylvania. Their prototype, the Bantam Reconnaissance Car, arrived on time, barely. It was crude, underpowered, and fragile, but it moved, it worked, and that was enough to prove the idea was possible. In a single gesture of mechanical faith, Bantam had drawn the outline of a revolution. Then came Willys Overland from Toledo, Ohio. Their answer was the MB, powered by a small but furious Go Devil engine, 60 horsepower of stubborn determination. It roared louder, pulled harder, and survived longer than anything its rivals could build. Its designers believed that reliability was not about avoiding stress, but enduring it. The Army noticed. Finally, Ford entered the race, not as the dreamer, but as the industrialist. Where Bantam had imagination and Willys had strength, Ford brought scale. They refined the Willys design for mass production, stamping an F on every bolt, every bracket, every corner of steel. It was pride disguised as precision, and it made the vehicle truly immortal. 2,000 parts, all interchangeable. One Jeep could be built from the bones of another. In war, that meant life. What emerged from this unlikely trinity was not a masterpiece of design, but a triumph of necessity, a machine forged in collaboration, competition, and deadline, the purest crucible of invention. The Jeep was born not from genius, but from pressure, not from perfection, but from the refusal to fail. It was an American paradox, a vehicle that combined improvisation with immortality. As production lines roared to life and ships prepared to cross the Atlantic, none of these companies could know what their creation would become. They had built a machine for the battlefield. What they had truly built was an idea. Fade out. Across the ocean, in the deserts of North Africa, German officers would soon see that idea in motion and laugh at it. For now, the first time the Germans encountered it, they didn't even dignify it with a name. In early reports from North Africa, intelligence officers referred only to a light American car with no armor. To men who commanded Panzers and half-tracks, it was an absurdity, an insult to the very idea of mechanized war. When a photograph reached Rommel's headquarters, his staff reportedly laughed. "We will crush it beneath our treads," one colonel said, and in that moment, the legend of the Jeep began not in admiration, but in mockery. In the deserts of Libya and Tunisia, the German Afrika Korps believed mobility was their private language. Their armored columns swept through sand with precision, tight formations, disciplined timing, and vehicles engineered for endurance. Against this, the Americans landed with a patchwork of new machines, still smelling of factory paint. Among them was that curious little car, small, square, open to the sky, and entirely unarmored. To the Germans, it looked like a mistake on wheels. But by 1942, the laughter had grown thin. The toy began appearing everywhere, darting between dunes, towing light guns, carrying officers, medics, and wounded men with equal ease. It scurried along tracks that swallowed trucks whole, and when the sand turned soft, its four-wheel drive clawed forward where heavier vehicles sank. It had no armor, yet it survived. It had no prestige, yet it endured. German observers watched these small convoys through binoculars and could not reconcile what they saw. How could a vehicle so crude keep moving when the rules of engineering said it should stop? One captured Jeep was brought into a repair depot for study. Mechanics circled it, lifted its hood, traced its wires. There was no elegance, no complexity, just a logic so direct it defied sabotage. One technician finally sighed, too simple to break. The officers took note. Even Rommel, the desert fox himself, came to respect the little machine. In his reports, he called it a soldier's horse, a phrase both dismissive and reverent. He understood what his engineers had missed. The Jeep's strength was not in what it possessed, but in what it lacked. As the months dragged on, the German staff's confidence began to crack. Their tanks still ruled the open ground, but the desert was not an open battlefield. It was a shifting sea. And in that sea, the light American car that shouldn't have existed had learned to swim. The laughter faded, replaced by something quieter, recognition. The Germans had built for perfection. The Americans had built for persistence. And persistence was winning. Fade out. Beyond the desert, on the rain-soaked fields of Europe, the same little machine was about to face a different enemy. Mud, the equalizer of empires. By 1943, the Jeep had ceased to be a curiosity. It had become a constant, a moving punctuation mark in the grammar of war. Wherever the map unfolded, there it was, bouncing through ruins in Italy, crawling over coral in the Pacific, weaving between hedgerows in France. It did not belong to any single front or climate. It simply learned the world as it found it. In Europe, it became the messenger. It darted between command posts, carried dispatches through artillery fire, and ferried officers who no longer dared to rely on radio. Mud splattered its windscreen, shrapnel scarred its hood, yet it kept running. Drivers learned to feel the terrain through the wheel, every rut, every stone, until the Jeep seemed less a machine than an extension of nerve and will. Where horses once bore the burden of command, now this little vehicle carried the pulse of entire armies. Across the Pacific, it transformed again. On islands where the air shimmered with humidity and salt, the Jeep became a lifeline. It hauled crates of ammunition through jungles slick with rain, ferried stretchers from field stations to makeshift airstrips, and pulled stranded aircraft from the sand. Pilots used it as a tow tractor, doctors as an ambulance. Its engine coughed in the heat, but it never refused. Even when bridges collapsed and roads dissolved, soldiers found ways to coax it forward: planks for tires, vines for tow lines, faith for fuel. In Italy, it climbed. With rope and winch, jeeps dragged mountain guns up goat paths where no truck could follow. Artillery crews nicknamed them mules made of metal. They hauled food, men, and hope up slopes so steep that even mules refused them. At night, their engines echoed off the cliffs like the heartbeat of persistence itself. Farther east, in Burma, the terrain turned from stone to forest. There, jeeps carved trails through elephant grass, crossed rivers on bamboo rafts, and carried the wounded where even elephants could not pass. Their tires, patched with rubber and rope, spun through red clay and leech-filled swamps. Soldiers began to decorate them: names, charms, painted eyes, as though the machines were living beings deserving of protection. They were no longer it, they were she. Something had changed in the relationship between man and machine. The Jeep was not admired for its power, but trusted for its loyalty. Soldiers spoke to it, kicked its tires like an old friend, cursed it, and thanked it in the same breath. They trusted it more than they trusted orders from above, because unlike orders, the Jeep never lied. It either moved or it didn't, and when it did, it carried them out of hell. Its adaptability became legend. Wherever soldiers went, it mirrored them, painted white for medics, camouflaged for reconnaissance, stripped down for the desert, tarped for the rain. It carried generals 1 hour and privates the next, erasing rank in its open seats. It became both symbol and companion, a reminder that victory depended not on grandeur, but on grit. In a war defined by machines of destruction, this one machine seemed almost human. It shared the soldier's hardship, his silence, his endurance. It aged with him. Its dents told stories. Its scratches marked survival. When men spoke of home, the Jeep was part of that memory, because it had been there in every place they wished to forget. By the time 1944 arrived, it was more than a vehicle. It was a creed on 4 wheels. That simplicity, when tested by chaos, can become genius. The Jeep had learned the world, not by conquering it, but by listening to it, adapting, adjusting, enduring. Fade out. Ahead lay a new kind of battlefield, not the sunlit deserts or jungles, but the grey, endless mud of Europe, where even giants would stumble, and only motion itself would survive. Autumn, 1944. Europe had turned to mud. What had been fields of harvest and cobblestone roads only months before were now oceans of brown resistance. The rain came without pause, thin, cold, relentless, turning valleys into swamps and roads into memory. Soldiers said the ground itself had joined the war. Boots sank to the ankle. Wheels vanished beneath the surface. Every mile became an argument with the earth. The German army, once a machine of momentum, began to slow. Panzers that had thundered across Poland and France now sat mired in sludge, their treads spinning helplessly. Half-tracks froze in place, engines whining like trapped animals. Precision was powerless against saturation. The armor that had once inspired fear now served only to drag them deeper. Every drop of rain erased another advantage. The mud showed no mercy to technology, only to adaptability. And in that, the Americans held an unspoken weapon. Amid the chaos rolled the same small vehicles the Germans had once dismissed as toys. The Jeep, light, unarmored, unpretentious, did what nothing else could. It moved, slowly, often painfully, but always forward. Its tires, narrow and determined, found purchase where steel monsters failed. Its genius was not power, but lightness. At just over a ton, It skimmed the surface like a skipping stone while the giant sank. Four-wheel drive turned friction into progress, making the impossible merely difficult. Drivers removed the windshields to stop the mud from blinding them, lashed supplies to the sides, and covered the engines in oilcloth to keep out the rain. They became one with the machine, hands numb, eyes squinting through sleet, pushing through a world where movement itself had become rare. Every foot gained was a small victory. Every hill crested, a triumph of design over despair. The Jeep didn't charge or conquer. It persisted. And in that persistence, it revealed something fundamental about war, that the battlefield belongs not to those who strike hardest, but to those who can keep moving when everything else has stopped. Across ruined villages and sodden forests, they carried messages, ammunition, and hope. Where tanks sank, jeeps waded. Where trucks spun, jeeps climbed. They became the arteries of the Allied advance, flowing where the grand machinery of conquest could not go. Soldiers began to joke that God himself must drive one, for it alone seemed untouched by terrain. To the German eye, it was an insult to engineering, that such simplicity could triumph over perfection. But the mud was impartial. It cared nothing for pride or design. It rewarded only those who adapted, who yielded, who found motion within limitation. The Jeep, humble and stubborn, embodied that truth better than any doctrine ever written. By November, as the Western Front dissolved into one vast bog, entire divisions depended on it. Officers directed traffic by its headlights. Medics reached the wounded in its open bed. Infantry followed its tire marks as paths of faith. It became not just a machine, but a symbol, that endurance was not measured in strength, but in the refusal to stop. In the end, mud was the great equalizer. It reduced every army to the same primitive struggle against weight and weather. And in that primitive struggle, the lightest-hearted machine, the one designed not for pride but for purpose, emerged supreme. Fade out. Ahead, winter waits in silence, colder, deeper, and deadlier. The mud will freeze, and the frozen roads will carry tanks again. But before they do, one last lesson remains. Speed is not power. Movement is. The Jeep did more than move men and supplies. It changed the way they thought. In a war ruled by hierarchy and regulation, it became an agent of improvisation, a teacher of adaptability. To drive one was to understand that rules bent as easily as steel, and that victory often belonged to whoever could make something from nothing. Soldiers learned this lesson the hard way, often knee-deep in mud or knee-deep in trouble. When a spring snapped, they cut bamboo and bound it tight with wire. When a bridge was gone, they laid planks across rivers, testing each one with cautious hope before driving over. The Jeep seemed to invite invention, as if it whispered to its crew, "You can fix me. You can make me better." Soon, the transformations began. Men turned their Jeeps into whatever the moment required. A gun truck one morning, a radio carrier the next. In Italy, mechanics mounted twin machine guns on the roll bars, calling them poor man's tanks. In France, wire-laying crews spooled cable behind the rear axle, creating moving communication lines. In Burma, Jeeps were fitted with rail wheels, running along jungle tracks to deliver supplies where trains could not go. Every modification was improvised, unsanctioned, and utterly effective. The Germans watched this chaos with disbelief. Their doctrine of war relied on order, on plans, diagrams, chains of command. Vehicles were to be operated, not altered. To see Americans cutting, welding, and bolting new parts in the field felt like witnessing heresy. One captured report described the phenomenon with reluctant admiration. Their equipment is alive because their men are free to think. That was the quiet revolution, the way the Jeep turned soldiers into engineers. It did not ask for permission. It simply worked, and in working, it gave its users confidence to adapt the world around it. While the Wehrmacht's mechanical discipline demanded obedience, the Allied approach rewarded initiative. In the muddy, unpredictable terrain of Europe and Asia, that difference was decisive. In every muddy track and frozen road, a new philosophy emerged. Freedom was not just a political slogan, it was a method of problem-solving. The Jeep became its emblem, a symbol of movement not only across geography, but across thought. It carried with it the democratic spirit of invention. If it broke, fix it. If it can't be fixed, improvise. Its simplicity was its permission slip. Every crew treated their Jeep differently, each one a reflection of its driver's mind. Some painted names on the hoods: Lil Abner, Faithful Flo, Rough Stuff. Others hung charms or wrapped rope along the front bumper for luck. In that personalization lay something profound, a soldier's belief that even in war he could leave his fingerprint on what served him. To the Germans, this looked like disorder. To the Americans, it was life. The battlefield, stripped of predictability, rewarded creativity above conformity. And nowhere was that creativity more visible than in the little olive-drab machine that refused to be one thing. By late 1944, the Jeep had become more than a vehicle. It had become a creed on wheels. It represented not command from above, but competence from within. In its open cab, generals and privates sat shoulder to shoulder. No armor separated them. No polish disguised the dirt. It was, in every sense, a rolling democracy. And as it bounced through shellfire and storms, its rattling frame carried more than men. It carried an idea that freedom, at its purest, is the ability to adapt, and that even in war, the simplest machine could remind the world what that looked like. Fade out. Ahead lies the test of that freedom. The winter offensive, when every machine and every man would be pushed to the limit, and only those who could still move would endure. Winter, 1944, the Ardennes. The last great gamble of the German army had begun. Snow fell in sheets, muffling the sound of engines and footsteps alike. Forests stood silent under the weight of frost, concealing the largest armored assault the Western Front would ever see. For a moment, it seemed the old power of the Blitzkrieg had returned, Panzers pushing west once more through the frozen heart of Belgium. But the war had changed, and so had the world it was being fought in. The same steel beasts that had once raced across the plains of France now groaned under the burden of their own perfection. German tanks dominated the open ground, but the open ground was gone. The Ardennes was a maze of trees, mud, and narrow roads that twisted like veins through the snow. The Panzers were too large, too heavy, too proud for such country. At first, they advanced like ghosts through the mist, engines roaring, treads biting into ice, and then, one by one, they began to sink. Fuel froze in the lines, gears jammed with ice, treads cracked against hidden roots. The precision that had once made them invincible now made them prisoners of the cold. Among them moved the smallest vehicle in the Allied arsenal, the Jeep. It did not roar or crush or dominate. It slipped quietly through the gaps, weaving between wrecks, over drifts, through gullies that swallowed men whole. Where tanks halted, Jeeps threaded their way forward, carrying dispatches through chaos, ferrying wounded from under shell fire, bringing ammunition where trucks could not go. It was the artery of an army that refused to stop bleeding. In one corner of the front, a single Jeep could deliver a crate of shells faster than a convoy of trucks. In another, a medic's Jeep carried 6 men stacked like firewood, their breath frosting in the air as the little machine crawled through the snow. Drivers learned to wrap engines in blankets, to heat oil pans with candles, to coax life from machinery that should have frozen hours before. The Jeep was never designed for this kind of winter, but it learned, as men did, to endure. German officers watching from ridgelines saw them through binoculars, those same toy cars from North Africa, now everywhere. They bypassed immobilized Panzers as if the laws of terrain no longer applied. One Panzer commander, his tank trapped axle-deep in ice, wrote later, "We could see them moving freely while we sat in place, burning the last of our fuel for warmth." The irony was total. The machines once celebrated as the pinnacle of engineering had become monuments of futility. Their engines were too fine, their tolerances too tight. Precision had become fragility. German officers, once proud of the purity of their craftsmanship, now cursed it with the same bitterness they once reserved for defeat. In contrast, the Jeep thrived in imperfection. Its parts rattled, its panels bent, its gears growled in protest. But it moved. It did not need perfection to survive. It needed only purpose, and that purpose was movement. The more it endured, the clearer the truth became. Complexity was captivity. As the battle raged, the cold grew merciless. Entire armored columns froze in place. Abandoned tanks dotted the roadsides like iron tombstones, their crews huddled around makeshift fires. Yet the Jeeps still came, headlights dimmed, engines low, the rhythm of their movement as steady as a heartbeat in the dark. They carried orders that decided battles and medicine that saved lives. In that frozen silence, they became the voice of momentum itself. By the end of the Ardennes offensive, the German advance had collapsed, not from lack of courage or firepower, but from immobility. The snow had defeated the steel. What remained standing, or rather, what remained moving, were the small, simple machines that could bend where others broke. When the thaw finally came, and the wrecks began to rust in the melting snow, soldiers walked past them in quiet understanding. The war of giants was ending. The age of agility had begun. Fade out. Ahead, in the shadows of the collapsing Reich, the Jeep would find new roles, and a new kind of enemy, one that no engine could outrun, the end of war itself. War had always belonged to the visible, the great columns, the thunder of tanks, the banners that moved with the wind. But by 1942, a quieter kind of war had begun, a war of shadows fought in the empty spaces between fronts, and at its center was a machine never meant for stealth, the Jeep. Partisans and commandos across Europe discovered what armies had overlooked, that mobility could be a form of invisibility. The Jeep, stripped of doors and canvas, became the vehicle of ghosts. In occupied France, resistance fighters used them to ferry arms through forests and fields too narrow for trucks. In the Balkans, partisans lashed them to mules and dragged them up mountain paths. They moved in silence until the engines coughed to life, and then vanished into night once more. But nowhere did the Jeep's legend grow faster than in the deserts of North Africa. Under the relentless sun, the British Special Air Service reimagined the vehicle entirely. Gone were the standard windshields and markings. In their place, extra fuel cans, belts of ammunition, twin Vickers K machine guns mounted on bare frames. Painted in camouflage that matched the dunes, they looked more like scavengers than soldiers. Their mission, strike fast, strike deep, and never be seen twice. Night after night, these desert raiders crossed hundreds of miles behind German lines. They navigated by stars and memory, appearing suddenly at Luftwaffe airfields that believed themselves secure. Within minutes, the stillness of the desert would shatter, fuel dumps exploding, aircraft burning, the hiss of machine guns echoing through the sand. Then, just as suddenly, the Jeeps were gone. German intelligence called them Geisterautos, ghost cars. Patrols were sent to intercept them, But there was nothing to catch. The Panzers, powerful but ponderous, could neither pursue nor predict them. By the time the desert winds erased their tire tracks, the raiders were already beyond reach, drinking tepid water beneath the cold stars. Even Rommel, who had once dismissed the Jeep as a toy, grudgingly respected it now. The vehicles that mocked engineering logic had become instruments of asymmetry, cheap, fast, and lethal in their unpredictability. They blurred the line between soldier and saboteur, between order and improvisation. In their hands, the Jeep became not a car, but a chariot of irregular warfare. Elsewhere, the myth multiplied. American paratroopers in Italy used them to slip through broken terrain, cutting phone lines and supply routes. Polish resistance groups used captured Jeeps to raid German convoys, often painting over the US stars with their own emblems. Each story added to the legend. It goes anywhere but home. The phrase spread quietly through the ranks, a mix of admiration and melancholy. To soldiers who drove them, the Jeep was freedom incarnate, but also exile. It never belonged to peace. Its home was motion, dust, mud, salt, and smoke, and those who rode it knew that once they climbed aboard, there was no guarantee of return. For the enemy, it represented a new kind of terror, one that could not be measured in tonnage or armor thickness. The Panzer might dominate the battlefield, but it could not control the spaces in between. The Jeep lived in those spaces, thriving where strategy thinned and chaos began. It was war stripped to its essentials: speed, courage, and the will to act without waiting for permission. By 1943, its silhouette had become as recognizable as any tank, and yet it carried none of their arrogance. The Jeep's power was humility, the knowledge that effectiveness lay not in mass or might, but in adaptability. Each time it emerged from the darkness, struck and disappeared, it rewrote the meaning of mobility in modern war. The men who drove them often spoke of the silence afterward. The long, cold drive through the desert, headlights blacked out, engines barely audible over the wind. No songs, no boasts, just the rhythmic rattle of metal and the unspoken understanding that what they carried was more than weapons. They carried possibility. By the time the Axis began to retreat, even German field manuals made mention of these elusive machines. They had become both myth and method, a symbol of how ingenuity could humble empires, fade out. As Europe burned and the fronts collapsed inward, the same little vehicle that prowled the desert now rolled toward Germany itself, carrying not raiders, but the message of an approaching end. By 1945, the world's roads, if they could still be called that, belonged to the Jeep, from the beaches of Normandy to the jungles of Burma, from the frozen forests of the Ardennes to the shattered ruins of Berlin. Its shape had become a constant in the landscape of war. 500,000 of them now roamed every theater of combat. No tank, no aircraft, no battleship existed in such numbers. The Jeep had become the pulse of the Allied machine, the quiet, relentless sound of movement itself. It was a strange irony. The war that had begun with armor and intimidation ended with agility and trust. The mighty Panzers that once rolled like thunder across Europe now lay abandoned by the roadside, their tracks half buried in mud. The Jeep passed them without notice. It had no need to gloat. The contrast said everything. The symbol of German power was immobilized strength. The emblem of Allied victory was humble motion. In sheer scale, the balance was staggering. For every German tank left fighting in 1945, there were 10 Jeeps in service, each one cheaper, lighter, and infinitely more useful. They carried generals to strategy meetings, chaplains to field hospitals, photographers to history's edge. They ferried prisoners, diplomats, ammunition, and messages. In every photograph of surrender, From Reims to Rangoon, somewhere in the frame stands a jeep, mud-streaked, dented, faithful. Behind every handshake and every document lay the hum of its small, stubborn engine. Its ubiquity made it almost invisible. It was no longer merely a vehicle, it was infrastructure. Soldiers stopped noticing its presence, the way one stops noticing breath. It became the background to everything, the laughter, the exhaustion, the long silence after victory. The war had proven that the future would not belong to what was heaviest, but to what could move. The Jeep was the proof. It went where tanks could not, where aircraft could not land, where ships could not sail. It had no armor, but it carried the armored will of millions. It was not a weapon, yet it defeated weapons by outlasting them. Even in triumph, there was humility in its design. When the Allies drove through liberated cities, crowds cheered for the men, not for the machines. But those same men would tell you that the Jeep had earned its place among them. It had become the silent comrade, its seat worn smooth by exhaustion, its steering wheel greasy from countless hands. In the end, the Panzer represented domination. The Jeep represented endurance. One sought to control the world, the other to traverse it. When the fires burned out and the roads filled once more with life, it was not the tank that remained useful. It was the Jeep, a machine for peace as easily as for war. It plowed fields, delivered mail, carried children to school. The same vehicle that once carried soldiers through mud now carried doctors through villages. In its unassuming form lay the moral of the age. Power had changed shape, no longer a matter of armor or intimidation, but of adaptability, utility, and shared purpose. The Jeep was never the star of the war, and yet, in the quiet arithmetic of history, it became its most enduring artifact. It was a machine for movement, not menace, an object of function that had accidentally become a symbol of freedom. The armies that once mocked it had built their legacies from its lessons, that simplicity could triumph over sophistication, and that the measure of a machine was not how much it could destroy, but how far it could go. When the final miles were driven and the convoys came home, the world looked different. Roads led forward now, not into conquest, but into reconstruction, and leading those roads was the same small vehicle that had crossed every battlefield, asking for nothing but fuel and faith. Fade out. The engines fall silent. The war of machines is over. And somewhere, on a muddy road, now quiet with spring rain, the little car that never stopped finally rests, its work complete, its story only beginning. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, the world faced a new kind of terrain. Not the battlefields of mud and ruin, but the shattered landscapes of peace. Cities lay open like wounds. Bridges hung broken over rivers that had carried both armies and hope. Across this reconstruction of civilization rolled a familiar shape, small, square, unpretentious. The Jeep, once a soldier's companion, had survived its war and was already finding another. The same machine that had crawled through shellfire now carried doctors through mountain villages and engineers across collapsed roads. Farmers harnessed it to plows. Explorers used it to chart regions no map had yet claimed. In jungles, deserts, and flooded valleys, the Jeep's rattle returned, not as the sound of invasion, but as the rhythm of rebuilding. Its tires traced new paths where tanks had left scars, turning destruction into direction. For the first time in years, the Jeep's passengers did not wear helmets. They carried tools, medicine, and letters home. Soldiers had called it the faithful mule. Now it carried faith itself. In peace, it proved what its creators had always intended, that mobility is not only a weapon, it is a lifeline. Germany, too, watched the world move again. In its factories, under Allied supervision, A new generation of engineers rebuilt their nation's transportation from the ashes. Trucks, cars, and tractors began to emerge, many modeled after the very American vehicle that had once defied their own machines. The Panzer, once a symbol of unstoppable force, became a relic of a defeated vision. But the Jeep, its former adversary, lived on, in the designs of post-war Europe, in the factories of Wolfsburg and Stuttgart, in the very notion that utility could be beautiful. In America, its transformation was just as profound. The Willys Overland Company, once a wartime supplier, reintroduced its creation to the civilian world. They called it the CJ, the civilian Jeep. It was nearly identical to its military ancestor, save for the paint and the purpose. For veterans returning home, it was a piece of memory they could keep. The same engine note, the same reliability, now devoted to peace. It plowed fields, hauled timber, and brought families into the wilderness. That simple, unassuming shape, the flat hood, the 7-slot grille, the upright stance, became the birthmark of something new, off-road culture. Men who had once crossed rivers under fire now crossed them for sport. The Jeep had turned survival into recreation, endurance into adventure. Its design carried with it the lessons of war, simplicity, adaptability, and the confidence to move forward when others stopped. In time, the Jeep's spirit spread beyond steel and rubber. It became an idea, a shorthand for ingenuity, for resilience, for quiet courage. Nations copied it, painted it in their own colors, gave it new names: Land Rover, Toyota Land Cruiser, Gaz. But beneath every iteration, the same philosophy endured: function before form, reliability before pride. The Jeep had proven that excellence need not be complicated, and that the most enduring legacy of war might not be destruction, but the tools built to overcome it. Simplicity outlived the empires that mocked it. The Panzer lay entombed in museums, admired but inert. The Jeep still moved. It crossed continents, not for conquest, but for connection. It became a bridge between soldiers and civilians, between necessity and creativity. A machine born for war had become a citizen of peace. By the mid-20th century, it was everywhere: on farms in Iowa, in clinics in Kenya, on mountain passes in Nepal. To see one was to glimpse a memory of the century's hardest lesson, that endurance is the truest form of strength. The little car that once slipped through the mud of France now rolled across the soil of a recovering planet. What had been a symbol of improvisation became a blueprint for resilience. The Jeep no longer followed armies, it led generations. Fade out. In the next decade, the world would change again. But its motion would still carry the same heartbeat, a rhythm first set by a small machine that taught humanity to keep moving forward. Every war reveals not only the weapons men build, but the ideas that build them. Beneath the roar of engines and the smoke of battle lies philosophy, unspoken but visible in steel. In that sense, the Jeep was never just a vehicle. It was America, rendered in metal, flexible, improvisational, unpretentious. It had no rank, no vanity, no ornament. Its parts were equal, each necessary, none decorative. It reflected a society that believed in motion over monument, in purpose over polish. It carried generals and privates in the same open seat, the same wind on their faces, the same mud on their boots. No doors, no barriers, only function. Democracy, simplified to its mechanical essence. The Germans built machines for admiration. Their tanks and aircraft were expressions of pride, masterpieces of precision meant to inspire awe. The Americans built machines for use. Where the German engineer sought perfection, the American sought practicality. One designed for spectacle, the other for survival. The difference was more than mechanical. It was moral. The Panzer was beautiful, but brittle. The Jeep was crude, but alive. One embodied hierarchy, the other equality. One demanded obedience to its design, the other invited collaboration. Soldiers didn't just drive Jeeps, they shaped them, modified them, made them their own. It was the kind of relationship only possible in a system that trusted the individual more than the institution. In that difference lay destiny. Germany's machines were superior in form, but enslaved by it. America's were flawed, but free. The war proved that adaptability, not precision, decides survival. The Jeep was the purest expression of that truth, a small machine that refused to fail because it was never afraid to be imperfect. Long after the fighting ended, the contrast remained. The factories that once built weapons turned to peace, but the philosophies endured. Germany continued to build machines of mastery, cars of immaculate craft and rigid design. America built vehicles meant to move through imperfection. Muddy roads, rocky fields, unknown terrain. Both nations prospered, but their machines still whispered the lessons of the war that had defined them. The Jeep's true victory was not tactical, it was ideological. It proved that motion itself could be a kind of freedom. To move, to improvise, to endure, that was the creed it carried across continents. Every dent in its frame, every scratch on its hood, spoke of resilience born from imperfection. It was proof that greatness can come not from control, but from acceptance. In time, historians would see it not just as a military tool, but as a philosophical artifact. The Jeep represented the victory of an idea, that freedom is not static, but kinetic. It is not a structure, it is a journey. And those who can adapt, who can keep moving when others stop, are the ones who shape history. Wars end, but methods endure. The Jeep's influence stretched far beyond battlefields, into how nations built, how industries thought, how people lived. Its descendants rolled through jungles, construction sites, and city streets, carrying with them the same quiet principle. Keep it simple, keep it working, keep it free. History rarely remembers machines of ego. It remembers those that carried ideas. The Jeep carried one of the greatest, freedom through motion, not victory through destruction, but through endurance. As decades passed, its silhouette remained unchanged. 2 seats, 4 wheels, one purpose. A reminder that even in an age of complexity, simplicity still moves the world forward. Fade out. The war of machines was over, but the idea that movement itself could be liberty had only just begun. In the beginning, they laughed. German officers, standing beside their Panzers, looked across the battlefield at the small olive-drab cars of the American army and saw absurdity. No armor, no weapon, no grandeur. Amerikanische Spielzeugautos, they called them, American toy cars. They laughed because they believed that power meant weight and that strength required size. They did not yet understand that the war they were fighting was changing its definition of power entirely. The laughter faded slowly, and then all at once, for the Jeep was never designed to impress. It was designed to move. It taught the world a lesson the Germans had forgotten. That motion itself is might. It crossed mountains that tanks could not climb, waded through rivers that trucks could not ford, and slipped through forests where engines of conquest sank into silence. Where the Panzer halted, the Jeep continued. Where precision froze, simplicity endured. By war's end, it had carried entire armies across continents, and ideas across generations. It became the connective tissue of the Allied effort, a machine that transcended rank and nationality. Soldiers from 6 nations drove it. Generals planned empires from its seats. It appeared in every theater, every climate, every photograph of advance or surrender. 500,000 machines, each with the same purpose, to keep humanity in motion when the world itself seemed to stop. The Panzer, symbol of engineered perfection, was powerful only while fuel and fortune remained. The Jeep needed neither abundance nor admiration. Its power came from its humility, from the notion that progress does not always roar. Sometimes it hums quietly through mud and rain, carrying a wounded man or a radio, or a message that changes the course of war. It defeated the Panzer not through destruction, but through persistence, not with firepower, but with possibility. In the mud of Europe, arrogance rusted. Steel cracked, ambition slowed, but simplicity endured. The Jeep outlived the empire that mocked it because it embodied the truth that all great machines eventually forget. Purpose outlasts pride. Its thin frame and rattling heart carried something that no armor plate ever could: the belief that function, not form, defines greatness. When the war was over, the battlefield's laughter returned, but this time it came from the victors. Soldiers told stories of the little car that pulled artillery from the snow, that climbed mountains in Italy, that saved lives under fire. The Jeep had become both legend and proverb. It was no longer the tool of an army, it was the symbol of what that army had fought for: resilience, ingenuity, and faith in the ordinary. Its spirit endured long after the uniforms changed. It rolled into farms, jungles, and cities, carrying doctors instead of officers, and hope instead of ammunition. It became the first vehicle of peace that still bore the scars of war, and wherever it went, it carried with it the quiet irony of its own story, that those who once laughed at it had built their machines to be admired, while this one had been built simply to endure. The war of machines ended as a lesson in humility. The tank may have conquered nations, but the Jeep conquered time. It proved that history remembers not the loudest, but the most lasting, not the perfect, but the practical. In every survivor of that era, the memory remains of a sound, an engine's steady rhythm, carrying them forward when the world was falling apart. They laughed at the Jeep once. They never laughed again.